Julian Thorne, Duke of Amesbury, turned 30 years old in 6 months' time, and every physician who had ever examined his heart agreed on precisely one thing, that he was unlikely to see 31. His father had died at 32. His grandfather had died at 9 and 20. The Corbin heart, as 3 generations of physicians had come to call it, with the same grim, clinical certainty they might apply to any hereditary curse, simply gave out sooner or later, and always far too soon. Julian had spent the whole of his adult life being told, in careful, measured tones, exactly what he must never do to protect the fragile, failing organ in his chest. He decided, some months before his 30th birthday, that he intended to do exactly one thing it forbade him, just once, before whatever time remained ran out entirely. He wanted a single, unguarded, perfect memory. What he received instead, from a woman who never once knew she was giving it to him, was considerably more than a memory could ever hold. Before we get into how it started, this is a brand new channel, and if you love a story where a man expecting only an ending discovers, instead, an entire beginning, hit subscribe now so you don't miss how far this one goes. Now, here's how it began. The Corbin family's heart trouble had claimed 3 generations of dukes before their time, a hereditary weakness the family's physicians had tracked with grim, careful documentation since Julian's great-grandfather first collapsed suddenly at his own dinner table at the age of 31, and Julian had grown up entirely in its shadow, watching his own father decline through his final years with the same slow, terrifying pattern of fainting spells and breathless exhaustion that the family physicians now warned, with increasing frequency, they were beginning to observe in Julian himself. He remembered, with a specificity that had never once faded, the particular afternoon of his father's death, having been summoned from his own rooms by a housemaid's frantic, breathless knocking, and finding his father, already collapsed across the surface of his study desk, the household physician, arriving too late to do anything beyond confirm what the stillness of the room had already made plain. Julian had been 22 at the time, newly returned from his own studies and still young enough to have believed, in some private, unexamined corner of his mind, that his father's occasional dizziness and breathlessness were simply the ordinary complaints of a man growing older, rather than the specific, terrible warning sign the family physicians had apparently understood it to be for years, without ever fully explaining its gravity to Julian himself. His father died when Julian was 22, collapsing in his own study on an unremarkable Tuesday afternoon, with no warning beyond the same mild, occasional dizziness Julian had already begun experiencing himself by that age. And the funeral had been, for Julian, considerably less a moment of grief than a moment of terrible, dawning recognition, the understanding that he was watching, with painful clarity, the exact shape his own future was very likely to take. His mother, the Dowager Duchess, had responded to her husband's death with a fierce, overwhelming determination to save her only son from precisely the same fate, and had spent the following 8 years constructing, around Julian's entire existence, a regime of careful restriction that the family's physicians, adhering to the prevailing medical wisdom of the era, had wholeheartedly endorsed. Strenuous exercise was forbidden on the theory that any exertion might overtax his weakened heart. Strong emotion of any kind, whether excitement, anger, or passionate attachment, was to be avoided with equal care, the physicians warning gravely that any sudden rush of feeling carried genuine risk of triggering the very collapse they were all trying so desperately to prevent. Julian had grown from a young man of 22 into a man approaching 30, having lived, by careful design, an existence almost entirely without dancing, without vigorous riding, without the ordinary passions and disappointments that filled other men's lives, a joyless, meticulously managed half-life that his mother genuinely believed, with every fiber of her grieving heart, was the only thing standing between her son and the same early grave that had already claimed his father and grandfather before him. Julian had accepted this careful, restricted existence for years, with the same resigned, dutiful patience he brought to every burden his family's particular curse required of him, understanding, in the abstract, that his mother's fear came from genuine love rather than any wish to diminish him. But as his 30th birthday drew nearer, the particular milestone that had claimed his own grandfather within the year and his father not long after, Julian found himself increasingly haunted by a specific, aching regret that had nothing to do with the length of his life and everything to do with its content. He had never once danced at a ball with genuine, unguarded pleasure, always careful to keep his exertions minimal and his emotions carefully in check. He had never once permitted himself the particular, reckless joy of falling, even briefly, into an unplanned connection with another person, having decided years earlier that it would be considerably crueler to any woman to let her love a man with so little time to offer her than to simply avoid the entanglement entirely. He understood, turning the matter over through many long, sleepless nights that spring, that he was approaching the very end of his allotted years, having genuinely lived almost none of them, and the realization settled into him with a grief considerably sharper than his own mortality had ever managed to produce on its own. He resolved, with a quiet, private determination, he did not share with his mother or with any of the physicians who had spent 8 years managing his existence with such careful, well-meaning caution, that he would allow himself exactly one evening of the life he had otherwise denied himself entirely. A masquerade ball hosted some weeks later by a distant cousin of his mother's, held far enough from London and attended by a guest list obscure enough that Julian judged the risk of recognition tolerably small, offered precisely the opportunity he required, a chance to attend as an anonymous, masked stranger, rather than the carefully managed Duke of Amesbury, and dance, just once in his shortened life, with the same reckless, unguarded pleasure other men took entirely for granted. Iris Wainwright had attended that same masquerade with considerably less weighty purpose than the mysterious masked gentleman she would encounter there that evening, having accompanied her father, a widowed scholar of natural philosophy, with a passion for cataloguing beetles that had left the family comfortably situated, but hardly fashionable, at the invitation of a former student, now grown into considerable local consequence. Iris's own mother had died when she was quite young, leaving her to be raised largely by her father, amid his cluttered study of specimen cabinets and half-finished manuscripts, an upbringing that had given her an education considerably more thorough than most young women of her circle possessed, alongside a habit of forming her own opinions and stating them plainly that her father, absorbed as he generally was in his beetles, had never once thought to discourage. Iris herself possessed a spirited, curious temperament that had, across 3 London seasons, earned her a reputation among the more conventional portions of society as somewhat too outspoken, too fond of asking pointed questions at dinner parties, too genuinely uninterested in the careful, decorative silence most young women of her circle had been trained to maintain. She had received, across those 3 seasons, 2 offers of marriage from perfectly respectable gentlemen, both of whom had made plain, in the careful, well-meaning way such things were generally communicated, that they hoped marriage might gently temper her more outspoken tendencies into something more conventionally suitable for a duchess or a countess, and Iris had declined both offers with a directness that scandalized her more conventional aunts, having concluded, somewhere in the course of those 2 courtships, that she would rather remain unmarried entirely than spend the whole of her life being quietly, patiently corrected by a husband who considered her genuine self a flaw requiring careful management. She attended the masquerade that evening with no particular expectation of romance, having largely concluded, after 3 unremarkable seasons, that the sort of man she might actually wish to marry seemed unlikely to appear at any gathering she was likely to attend, and had come instead simply for the pleasure of dancing and the anonymity the masks afforded her, usually rather too visible outspokenness. Julian found her partway through the evening, drawn by a laugh that carried across the crowded ballroom with a genuine, unguarded warmth, entirely unlike the careful, practiced amusement he was accustomed to hearing from London's more fashionable circles, and asked her to dance, with a boldness that surprised him considerably more than it surprised her, having spent so many years training himself never to make precisely this sort of impulsive, unplanned request of anyone at all. They danced through 3 full sets that evening, considerably more than propriety strictly allowed between 2 masked strangers, and Julian found himself, somewhere in the middle of that second set, laughing with a genuine, unrestrained delight he could not remember experiencing since long before his father's death, Iris's quick, unguarded wit drawing him into conversation after conversation that ranged from her father's Beatles to her own considerable opinions on the ridiculousness of certain fashionable dances, to a spirited, entirely unplanned debate about the merits of Gothic novels that left them both laughing far too loudly for the polite hush of a formal ballroom. Between the second and third sets, breathless and flushed in a manner that would have alarmed his mother's physicians considerably, Julian steered them both toward a quieter corner near the tall garden doors, ostensibly to catch his breath, though in truth he found himself simply wanting a few private moments away from the crowd to look at her properly. "You have opinions on everything," he observed, "and you offer every single one of them as though you expect to be argued with, and rather relish the prospect." "I generally am argued with," Iris said, "though rarely well. Most gentlemen seem to believe that disagreeing with a woman requires only volume rather than any actual reasoning behind it. You, sir, at least attempted an argument about the Gothic novel that had some genuine structure to it, even if I still believe you are entirely wrong about Mrs. Radcliffe's pacing." "I am not entirely wrong," Julian said, "though I confess I would rather continue being wrong about it for another full set than prove myself right and lose the argument's excuse to keep dancing with you." Iris laughed at that, a bright, genuine sound that Julian found himself wanting to hear again immediately, and it was in that particular unguarded moment, watching her laugh with her whole unrestrained self rather than the careful, practiced amusement he generally encountered in London's drawing rooms, that he understood, with a clarity that startled him, precisely how much of his own life he had spent avoiding exactly this sort of moment, out of fear, and precisely how unwilling he suddenly was to let the realization end when the music did. "You dance," Iris observed, partway through their third set together, "like a man who has never once been permitted to enjoy himself properly, and has decided tonight, of all nights, that he simply doesn't care." Julian, startled by the accuracy of the observation, found himself answering with more honesty than he had intended. "Perhaps I have decided precisely that," he said. "Perhaps tonight is the only evening of its kind I intend to permit myself, and I find I would rather not waste a single moment of it being careful." Iris studied him for a long moment through the edge of her mask, something curious and searching in her expression. "That sounds considerably sadder than you mean it to sound, sir," she said, "though I confess I find I would rather not spoil the evening by asking you to explain it. Dance with me instead, and tell me something ridiculous." He did, for the whole of that stolen evening, permitting himself, for the first time since his father's funeral, the particular, unguarded joy of simply existing in a moment without calculating its cost to his own fragile heart. And when the evening finally drew to its close, Julian understood, walking Iris to her father's waiting carriage with a reluctance he had not expected to feel so acutely, that he had received considerably more from the evening than the single, contained memory he had originally set out to claim. He did not give her his name, nor ask for hers beyond the simple, unadorned Iris she offered him at the evening's start, having decided, in the careful, deliberate logic he had spent years applying to every decision of consequence, that a single perfect memory required no complications of address or future correspondence to remain perfectly, permanently intact. He returned to his mother's careful, restrictive household the following morning, fully intending to treasure that single evening as the whole and complete gift he had asked of it, and found, to his own considerable dismay, that he could not stop thinking of her, not for a single full day across the whole of the following month. It was, by the particular and rather remarkable coincidence his story would come to turn upon, his own mother's growing determination to see him properly settled before whatever time remained to him ran out, a determination the Dowager Duchess pursued with an anxious, well-meaning persistence Julian found increasingly difficult to bear, that brought Iris Wainwright back into his life entirely by accident. The Dowager Duchess, having compiled a careful list of eligible young women she considered suitable for her son's diminished circumstances, had extended an invitation to a small country house gathering, and Iris, whose own father counted the hostess among his oldest scientific correspondents, arrived among the guests entirely, without any notion that the masked gentleman she had danced with so freely a month earlier would be standing, unmasked and instantly recognizable to her the moment their eyes met across the drawing room, as their own host's son. "You," Iris said, her composure fracturing for just a moment before she recovered it, watching Julian's own face drain of colour at the sight of her. "You are the Duke of Amesbury." "I am," Julian admitted, his voice considerably rougher than he intended. "And I owe you rather more of an explanation than I gave you a month ago, if you are willing to hear it." They found a private moment in the gardens later that same afternoon, away from the careful scrutiny of the Dowager Duchess's assembled guests, and Julian told her, with a plain honesty he had never once offered another living soul, beyond his own family and physicians, the whole of what had brought him to that masquerade a month earlier, the hereditary weakness that had claimed his father and grandfather before their time, the careful, joyless regime his mother's grief had built around his remaining years, and the single, private wish that had driven him, just once, to claim an evening of genuine, unguarded life before whatever time remained to him ran out. Iris listened to the whole of it, without once offering the careful, pitying sympathy Julian had spent years dreading from anyone who learned the truth of his condition, and when he finally finished, her first question was not one of comfort, but of genuine, pointed challenge. "And do you intend," she asked, "to simply return to that joyless existence now that your single perfect memory has been claimed, or has it occurred to you, even once, that perhaps the memory itself is proof your mother's careful restrictions might be doing you rather more harm than the heart trouble ever has on its own?" Julian had no ready answer for her, having never once permitted himself to seriously consider the question, and Iris, watching his uncertain silence, pressed the point further with a directness that struck him as considerably more bracing than any physician's careful counsel had ever managed to be. "I do not pretend to any medical expertise, Your Grace," she said, "but I watched you dance for 3 full sets a month ago, with more genuine colour in your face than I imagine your mother has seen from you in years, and you did not collapse. You laughed, loudly and often, and you did not collapse. I confess, I find myself wondering whether the careful, joyless life you have been living these past 8 years has actually protected your heart at all, or whether it has simply starved it of every single thing that might have made it worth protecting." The courtship that followed, conducted with a careful discretion neither of them fully managed to maintain, given the Dowager Duchess's watchful presence throughout that country house gathering, deepened over the following weeks into something Julian found himself entirely unable to resist, despite every careful, protective instinct he had spent years cultivating. He called upon Iris and her father with a regularity that soon became impossible to disguise, and found himself, across those weeks, gradually permitting himself small, incremental freedoms he had denied himself for years, a longer walk than his mother's physicians generally sanctioned, an evening of dancing at a modest local assembly that left him breathless, but genuinely, unmistakably happy, rather than in any actual physical distress. The Dowager Duchess, discovering the growing attachment between her son and a young woman she had never once placed upon her own carefully vetted list of suitable candidates, confronted Julian directly one evening with a fear so raw and unguarded that Julian understood, watching his mother's composure finally crack after 8 years of careful, determined control, precisely how much of her own grief she had poured into the elaborate protections she'd built around him. She found him in the estate's library, going over correspondence he had been putting off addressing, and closed the door behind her with a deliberateness that told him immediately This was not to be a brief conversation. "I watched your father die, in a room not unlike this one," the Dowager Duchess said, her voice tight with an old, carefully contained grief. "I have spent 8 years since making absolutely certain that I would never have to watch the same thing happen to you, and I have done it, Julian, at considerable cost to my own peace of mind, denying you every pleasure I feared might hasten the very thing I was trying to prevent. And now I watch you riding further than your physicians allow, dancing at assemblies you have no business attending, all for the sake of a young woman I did not choose and do not entirely trust to understand what she is risking on your behalf." "She understands considerably more than you credit her with, Mother," Julian said, though he kept his own voice gentle, understanding the depth of fear beneath his mother's sharpness. "I have already buried your father," the Dowager Duchess continued, her composure fracturing further. "I cannot bury you as well, Julian, and I will not stand by and watch you court a passionate attachment that every physician in London has warned me might be the very thing that finally stops your heart. And I cannot spend whatever years remain to me," Julian answered, with a gentleness he hoped might soften the force of what he needed to say, crossing the room to take his mother's hands in his own, "continuing to live as though I have already died, Mother. I understand your fear. I have carried a version of it myself for 8 years, and I understand, better than perhaps anyone alive, precisely what it cost you to build the walls around me that you built. But I would rather risk a shorter life genuinely lived than guarantee myself a longer one spent entirely in hiding from it. I am asking you to be frightened alongside me, if you must be frightened at all, rather than to build another wall meant to keep the fear out entirely, because I do not believe any longer that such walls have ever actually protected either of us." The Dowager Duchess said nothing further that evening, though she did not forbid the courtship outright either, and Julian understood, watching his mother leave the library with her own composure only partly restored, that he had won not her blessing, but simply her uneasy, watchful tolerance, a tolerance that would be tested considerably further before the matter was finally settled. It was a fainting spell some weeks later, brought on by nothing more strenuous than an unusually warm afternoon and a longer ride than he had attempted in years, that finally forced the matter to a genuine crisis. Julian had ridden out that morning specifically to clear his head, the tension between his mother's fear and his own growing determination to actually live, weighing on him more heavily than he'd admitted to either woman, and had pushed himself, without entirely meaning to, considerably further and faster than his usual careful limits allowed, some reckless part of him wanting, in that moment, to simply outrun the whole complicated weight of his own mortality for an hour. He returned to the stable yard, flushed and breathless, dismounted with hands that had begun, he noted, with a distant, disconnected alarm, to tremble rather more than usual, and the world tilted and went dark before he had taken more than 2 full steps toward the house. He came to consciousness slowly, aware first of raised, frightened voices, and then of Iris's face above him, pale and stricken in a way he had never once seen from her across the whole of their acquaintance, her composure shattering completely, for the first time since Julian had known her. She had arrived that same afternoon for an entirely ordinary call, and instead found herself kneeling in the dust beside an unconscious duke. And it was her voice, sharp and commanding in a manner that cut through the general panic of the assembled grooms, that Julian dimly registered directing someone to fetch the household physician, and someone else to send for his mother, before her hand found his own, and gripped it with a fierceness that told him, even through the fog of his own returning senses, precisely how frightened she had actually been. He woke fully some hours later in his own bed, to find both his mother and Iris at his bedside, seated on opposite sides of the room, in a silence that suggested neither of them had spoken much to the other in the intervening hours, and understood, in the tense, frightened quiet of that recovery, that his mother's worst fears had apparently been confirmed in the most public and terrifying manner possible. It was Iris, however, once Julian's own physician had completed his examination and pronounced the episode consistent with the family's known weakness, rather than any sudden, dramatic decline, who refused to accept the matter as settled, and pressed, with the same bracing directness she had shown him in the garden weeks earlier, for a second opinion from a physician considerably more current in his understanding of heart conditions than the family's own aging attendant, a Dr. Emmeline Rourke, recently returned from further study on the continent, whose particular expertise Iris had learned of through her own father's scientific correspondence. Dr. Rourke's examination, conducted over the course of a full week rather than a single hurried consultation, arrived at a conclusion considerably more nuanced than either the Corbin family's original grim prophecy or any simple reversal of it. Julian's heart did, in fact, carry the same hereditary weakness that had claimed his father and grandfather, a genuine and lifelong condition that would require careful, ongoing management for the whole of his life. But Dr. Rourke, drawing on considerably more current medical understanding than the family's own long-trusted physician had ever possessed, believed that the fainting spells and general fragility Julian had experienced across recent years owed as much to 8 years of near-total physical inactivity, chronic isolation, and suppressed emotion as to the underlying weakness itself, a body and spirit both starved of exactly the vigor and joy that might otherwise have strengthened them, rather than a condition that required total avoidance of every strenuous or passionate experience in order to survive. Moderate, regular exercise, genuine emotional connection, and a life lived with purpose and pleasure, rather than fear, Dr. Rourke explained at careful length, would very likely serve Julian's constitution considerably better than the anxious, protective isolation his mother's grief had constructed around him. Though she was careful to note, with an honesty Julian found he trusted considerably more than easy reassurance, that his heart would always require a measure of genuine care, and that she could offer no guarantee of the exact number of years remaining to him, only a considerably more hopeful path through whichever years he was given. The Dowager Duchess, hearing Dr. Rourke's full assessment, wept in a manner Julian had not witnessed from his mother since his father's funeral, the particular, exhausting grief of 8 years spent protecting her son from a danger that had, in some genuine measure, been partly of her own careful making, and Iris, present for that difficult conversation at Julian's own quiet request, took the older woman's hand with a gentleness that surprised them both, and told her, with a sincerity that finally seemed to reach past 8 years of fear, that she understood precisely why a mother might build such careful walls around a son she could not bear to lose, and that she hoped, going forward, they might build something rather less confining together instead. Julian and Iris were married the following spring, with the Dowager Duchess standing beside them at the altar, rather than watching from a careful, anxious distance, and the ceremony itself carried none of the hushed, careful quality that had governed so much of Julian's adult life, filled instead with genuine laughter and the particular, unguarded joy of a man who had very nearly convinced himself he would never be permitted to claim it. Dr. Rourke attended as an honored guest, and remarked, watching the newly married couple dance their first set together with a vigor that would have horrified Julian's old physician entirely, that she had rarely seen a patient's constitution improve so markedly in so short a span, a change she attributed as much to the considerable joy now evident in his daily life as to any specific course of treatment she had prescribed. Julian, who had once believed he was claiming a single perfect evening before an ending he considered already settled, found himself instead building, year upon year, a life considerably fuller and considerably longer than any physician had once dared promise him, his heart carefully but genuinely lived with, rather than merely protected against, each ordinary morning arriving as a gift he had, for 8 long years, very nearly convinced himself he would never be permitted to properly claim. He continued to require Dr. Rourke's careful, ongoing attention for the whole of his life, and never once pretended, in the years that followed, that his condition had simply vanished entirely, understanding that genuine hope required honesty about its actual boundaries, rather than any comfortable fiction of complete cure. But he lived those years with a fullness his younger self, dancing that single masquerade set and believing it his only allotted joy, could never once have imagined possible. And when his 30th birthday finally arrived and passed without incident, followed by his 31st, and then his 32nd, the Dowager Duchess wept again, though this time, for the first time in nearly a decade, the tears carried nothing but relief. If watching a man who expected only an ending discover an entire life waiting on the other side of his fear left you smiling, you know exactly what to do. This channel is brand new, and every subscriber genuinely helps us keep telling stories like this one. So if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss the next release. Give this one a like if you believe Iris was right to challenge everything Julian had been told about his own heart. Share it with someone who needs a reminder that a fuller life is often worth more than a longer, careful one. And let me know in the comments what you think Julian's one perfect memory would have been if Iris had never found him first. If anything in this story touched close to home, whether it's living with a serious health condition yourself or loving someone who does, I hope you have people in your corner willing to ask the hard, hopeful questions the way Iris did.